I mean, because Christianity, at the end of the day, with no proof, everything is mythology. Everything. With no proof. With proof, then you examine the proof. It's super simple.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So when you say the book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
But when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, we literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
If you want to have any chance of being able to give answers to the people of today's day and age, you need to know some apologetics. The society we live in is very secularized, very skeptical of these things. They're skeptical in a way that people were not in Jesus's time. They were skeptical for different reasons. They were skeptical of Jesus because it was absurd to them that God would be crucified.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Campfire Council podcast, a 0.5 episode. Today on the council, we have Milo, James once again. Thank you for being here. Joey's, Brandon, and myself, Luke. Today, we are going to be doing a reaction video to the Joe Rogan and Wes Huff podcast that came out like a month ago or so. We're going to play a couple clips, do some reactions, and hope you guys enjoy it. So, Milo, if you want to go ahead and...
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just start this off by saying I'm a huge Joe Rogan fan. I've been watching Joe Rogan for like 10 years. Definitely since like 2015 at least. Love his podcasts. One thing that Joe Rogan was famous for was his skepticism for a long time. Like, he was a big critic of Christianity, very much like an agnostic, not really an atheist, probably because of his psychedelic usage. But he was very critical of Christianity for a long time. And I was hoping and praying that he would have a Christian apologist on the podcast someday. And he has had the right guy on, Wes Huff. And we're very happy to see that. And you guys all had the chance to listen to it. Did you guys have any like initial thoughts before we dive into these clips?
I feel like the stuff that Wes Huff like researches and studies is beyond anything. Like I've never even really thought about stuff like that. And just like the different languages that they have to like piece together from like old texts and whatever of the Bible. And like, I just thought it was so fascinating listening to him. And he talks in a very like enthusiastic manner. Like, you can just tell he enjoys what he does.
Yeah.
And so it was just very cool. I've never seen anyone or heard of any work like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's cool to see someone going beyond experience of their faith, but digging into like the actual evidence that we have of Christianity, going back to like the original text and researching and learning new languages and just things that your average Christian probably does not look into, but it's really cool to learn about.
Yeah. Anyone else? James? So he's a historian, and I think the type of historian he is called a textual critic. They're basically concerned with like reconstructing ancient texts. So a lot of times, for a given ancient text, we'll have like fragments, and they try to piece together what the original text looked like. The cool part about working in the New Testament is there's so many fragments and manuscripts that they have like huge data sets that they can try to reconstruct what the original text might have looked like. So it's a pretty cool, very important field to get into. So I was hoping and praying for a long time that Joe Rogan would have some sort of Christian apologist on. He did have a guy named Stephen Meyer on the podcast. This was like a year ago or a year and a half ago, I think. I was super excited about him having Stephen Meyer on. Stephen Meyer is more of like into intelligent design and kind of arguing for God's existence. And when I was listening to that podcast, I was a little bit disappointed because for the questions that Joe Rogan had, I'd felt like Stephen Meyer might not have been the right guy. And what I didn't realize at the time is that the type of Christian apologist that Stephen Meyer isn't exactly the right person for Joe, because Joe has progressively become more and more open to the existence of God and the existence of the spiritual world. A guy like Stephen Meyer is specialized in like arguing for God's existence or the possibility that life might have been designed by God or an intelligent being at the very least. And that's not really what Joe's question is about. Joe is more, he's brought this up many times in the past, but he had this view that basically we have no idea what the New Testament looked like originally. The New Testament is just copies of copies, and it's like the game of telephone, and we just don't, he'll talk about how it's translated from different languages, and not all of the meaning of the original language is going to be transferred over to the new languages, stuff like that. So I think it's funny how God works. I think Wes Huff is the right, like God knew that like Wes Huff would be the right person to go on Joe Rogan. Another thing is for the listeners, I'd 100% encourage you to go listen to this podcast. The backstory is that Joe had this guy named Billy Carson on, who's kind of like ancient aliens, conspiracy type dude.
Job.
And he's very critical of the Bible, but a lot of his arguments against the Bible are pretty surface level. Billy Carson's friend, his like neighbor or something, invited Wes Huff to debate Billy Carson.
And he didn't even do it himself? He didn't like sign up for it?
No, he was invited by Billy Carson's friend.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So they had this debate on Billy Carson's friend's channel.
Gotcha.
And it didn't go well for Billy Carson. I think it was very clear to everyone listening that Billy Carson was not prepared for this in any way, and he had no ammunition against Wes Huff's arguments. And it caused like a big scene. And a lot of in fact, from just reading the comments, a lot of people that followed Billy Carson were like, this has kind of brought me back into Christianity, like seeing this debate, because
That's awesome.
I kind of see the holes in that line of thinking that people like Billy Carson had. We're not going to go into that debate like too much, but I encourage people to go search that out, because a lot of people do believe in that kind of stuff. But what I wanted to go through is kind of just a little bit of a history of what Joe Rogan used to be like. So we're going to watch a clip here. This is from a few years ago. I'm not sure which one was this.
9
This
years
is,
ago. Gosh.
Yeah, this is from a while ago. Yeah, this is probably about 9 years ago. So this was one of his older podcasts, and this is the Joe Rogan that I remember, but he's progressively changed as time has gone on.
Does God had one?
I'll go back to the beginning.
Because Christianity, at the end of the day, with no proof, everything is mythology. Everything with no proof. With proof, then you examine the proof. It's super simple. And anybody that argues against that is you're just biased. You have your own ideas. If you have some proof that there was a God, that this God had one son, and he made this son come down and get the fuck beat out of him and nailed to a board so that we could all have no sin. Can you show me some studies? Do you have a box of evidence that you can pull out and we can examine all the different pieces that points to the undeniable conclusion that that's true? Because if you don't, then it's a myth. Then you're believing mythology. Doesn't mean it's not real, but if you put all your fucking eggs in that basket and you don't have any proof at all, well, you're entering into this weird world where you don't pay attention to shit. You're entering into this weird world where you ignore certain aspects of things because you've decided what is and what isn't. That's not thinking. That's not thinking. That's like, it's convenient cookie holder placement of ideas. It's not thinking. Because if you're thinking, you can't accept it. If you're thinking, you go, wait, what? He came back from the dead? Has anybody ever done that? 3 days? Came back from the dead. I don't think you can do that. I mean, that's what people would do normally. But, like my kid had a function today, and I went to this function. and they're all we're singing "God Bless America," and there's like something about heaven in there, and their school prayer. I'm like, well, okay, are we teaching people? We're teaching kids things, right? What's heaven? Where is this? Is this a real thing? Are we just pretending heaven's real so the kids feel good and they can get through 12th grade? What are we doing here? What are we doing? You know, we have to make shit up about stuff that we don't know, instead of just accepting what we do know. Instead of just celebrating and accepting what we know about life, we have to pretend that there's a heaven, and you're going to go to heaven when you die. What the fuck are you talking about? Like, you're teaching my kid nonsense. Why don't you teach him some Rumpelstiltskin shit? Why don't you make some shit up about leprechauns? You're making shit up about heaven. I'm not saying heaven doesn't exist, but you're just making it up. You're teaching a school in a class. You're making them, and then in heaven, God in heaven. God in heaven? Where's heaven? Who's God? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? You're making up some shit. You're making up some shit in a school. Like, and you don't, okay, like if the kid comes to you, like, where is heaven on a map? Can you take me to, do we have a Google Earth? Can we check out heaven? Can I see the harp? Oh, well, you know, heaven is our Heavenly Father. That was another thing, Heavenly Father. Like, our Heavenly Father? Really? This is what we're teaching in school? Heavenly Fathers. How come he's not a chick? You know? Moms are usually better at, like, raising you than dads. Dad's working all the time.
It is weird that when you have a kid that you do nothing but lie to them their first 10 years of their life, like about Santa Claus, bunny rabbits, Jesus, monsters.
Well, the Jesus thing keeps going. That's the weirdest part about it. And again, it's just not saying that Jesus isn't real. It's just saying, like, if that story existed in any other form other than religion, you'd be like, what? If you looked at that story outside of religion, if it wasn't something that, you know, you made the sign of the cross every morning and went to school and prayed, if you just read the story about a guy who was magic and could turn water into wine, who could heal people. What did he do with fish? Did he fucking give people fish or some shit? Make some fish? The whole thing's so stupid. You'd be like, wait a minute, who told you this? Well, it's a long story. See, it was actually spoken about for about 1,000 years before anybody bothered to write it down. You'd be like, wait, what? Shut the fuck up. They told it for 1,000 years. The Old Testament, they told the Old Testament for 1,000 years. It was spoken for 1,000 years. That's so long. That's like, just stop and think how fucking stupid that is. That literally, that would be like going back to like the Julius Caesar days. And Julius Caesar, like 1,000 years ago, was that the Romans were around 1,000 years ago, right? No, before that. It'd be like Genghis Khan. It'd be like Genghis Khan's life, and no one bothers to write it down until now. I mean, that's so stupid. The idea behind that is so stupid that you could tell a story for 1,000 years and get it right when you write it down.
It is interesting, like, you know, Pope, you know, he believes in the Big Bang Theory and evolution's real. So it seems like they kind of have to slowly start accepting everything. But when it comes down to it, they still believe, you know, a magic man, you know, Jesus flying it around with lasers.
I tell you what, man, it always weirds me out when they have that guy on TV. It weirds me the fuck out. It weirds me out. I was watching Colbert. It was so strange, man.
All right.
It was Colbert and Gaffigan.
Going into like the Pope. But okay, so as you can see,
Wow.
Joe Rogan was very, very different like 9-10 years ago, or even further when he like started the podcast. I still liked listening to him because he had, you know, really interesting guests on, and as you can tell, he's a very entertaining guy. But he's at this point, what is a Wes Huff? Episode 2252. A lot of Christians have been waiting a long time for him to have like a solid Christian scholar on the podcast. And he just hasn't. He's had two people that I know of. He's had two people, Stephen Meyer and now Wes Huff. So let's go into the new clips. Also, I should say this. If for the people that if you don't listen to Joe Rogan, he's progressively become more open to these things. I don't know what exactly has happened, but he said some things like there. I don't have the clip ready to go, but there's like a clip of him saying that people just need Jesus. It was some cultural thing. I think he's beginning to recognize like the importance of Christianity, at least in society. Oh yeah, that's right. When he started having Jordan Peterson on, I think that definitely started to change him. At least to be open to the idea that the stories in the Bible are important for our culture to function. Did you guys ever watch any of those like Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogans?
I don't know if I
Yeah,
have.
it's been a long time though.
Okay, because that's I think I can trace that back to like when he started to become a little bit more open. But it's just been like a progressive change as time has gone on. So let's go into this first clip. We're not gonna go through the whole podcast, but these are just a few clips that we thought were kind of interesting. So in this one, where they're Wes is talking about the Isaiah scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran, and how accurate it is to like the modern copy. So this would be at least like a couple hundred years before Jesus, if I'm not mistaken.
This is when we're talking about the book of Isaiah?
Yeah, so there's a copy that they found in Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the next oldest copy of Isaiah, I believe, is like 1,000 years after that.
That's crazy.
So this pushed the date back to like for our oldest manuscript way back, which is important if you want to kind of figure out what the original text said. If it's closer to the original text, that's more evidence that you have it right.
A number of different languages. So the vast majority of it is in Hebrew, but there's also a lot in Aramaic and then Greek and in Nabatean. So it's like an umbrella term to just describe a whole bunch of literature. So a lot of it is biblical because it was written by this group out in the desert called the Essenes, who lived at Qumran. So, but then other stuff of it is just, it's just Jewish literature of various stripes that were hidden in caves all around the Dead Sea.
So the scrolls, as it were, aren't all biblical. Some of them is just a counting of the times.
Yeah. Oh, Jamie looked it up. 65 tons of gold and 26 tons of silver.
65 tons.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. How many Cuban links can you make out of that?
You can see why someone would
Wow.
try to track that down.
Boy.
Yeah.
Wow.
And when we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, like you have ones like the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is fully complete. Like it's a copy of the book of Isaiah, and it's a full complete scroll. But then other ones are so fragmentary that we think they're written in Hebrew, but we can't actually tell.
Oh wow.
Because no one's willing to like piece these. And this is true for a lot of stuff. So the largest grouping of papyri literature in the world is the Oxyrhynchus collection, which we get a good portion of our oldest manuscripts of the New Testament from. But if you go to Oxford and you look at the Oxford years, we literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is that
So
it
this is
right
the Great
there?
Isaiah Scroll. So if you go to Israel and
Wait,
you go...
is that papyrus?
Yes. No, I think that one is vellum.
What is vellum?
So I should be more specific. So parchment is animal skin. Vellum can be used synonymously with the term
So that
parchment.
scroll is over
Technically,
2,000
parchment
years
is
That's crazy.
like baby animal skin, like
Jeez.
calves or lambs. But
Are we
this
gonna be
is
muted,
the
by the
Great
way?
Isaiah Scroll. And
No,
you can see
no,
like
that's fine.
they stitch together the parchment because it's so long.
God, it's so beautiful. The way they wrote back then was so beautiful. I mean, maybe it's because I can't read it that it's so fat. Maybe if I saw English, I would think that's beautiful too.
Yeah.
Especially script, like cursive. Cursive is very beautiful. But that is so fascinating because obviously coming from a point of ignorance, the letters look so similar. Like so many of this is the what I always got about cuneiform. When I look at that, I'm like, it's just one particular sort of character that's this way and that way and up and down and
So as you can tell, like Joe Rogan, he's very open to this new evidence. Like a lot of this stuff he didn't know. I think he mentions in the podcast he spent like 20 hours or something like listening to Wes Huff's like research and stuff. So he's like really gotten into this. I think it's very cool. It's just, I don't know. It makes me very happy to see this.
I mean, I know Joyce knows this. I'm not a huge fan of Joe Rogan just because, like, I haven't really given him a chance too much. But from the clips I've seen, I think he's overrated. But this episode, I am more like open to listening to more Joe Rogan, and I like how open he is to the idea of it. But Joe Rogan seems very interested in facts.
Yes,
and he appreciates people that are like, they know what they're doing and like specialize in things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think that's really cool. Like you said before, that Wes Huff is on the episode.
Yeah.
Because he's connecting with them in a way that probably other Christians, through their perspective of experiences and just like the normal gospel, might not reach Joe Rogan.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah, it needed to be someone like Wes Huff
Yeah.
that's just an absolute expert.
Like you can even hear him just like, wow. Like he's just like amazed about like how much he knows, and it's just like it's clicking with how fascinating it is.
Yeah, and I think this is all related to his interest in ancient history and human origins and just thinking about the deep past. This is something that like really interests Joe Rogan.
I think this really shows like the way that maybe God's working in Joe Rogan's life. Because in the first clip you showed us, he was like, he's talking about like a box of evidence. Like he wanted a box of evidence or something, and this
That's
is it right here.
it.
Nine years later,
maybe
more. Like right there,
right?
Like that's amazing.
And this isn't none of this is proof that the events in the Bible actually took place. But it is attacking Joe Rogan's argument that we don't know what the original text said, and I don't know if he like fully fleshed out his idea in that clip that I showed you guys, but he said this in other podcasts that we just, sorry, is this cord in your way?
No.
Okay. He's said this in other podcasts that, that we don't know what they actually wrote, and that's just not the case. We may not have the original text. We have so many copies of the text. They can reconstruct what the original text probably looked like to a high degree of certainty. One thing I wanted to mention here is, so Wes says that the Isaiah scroll is word for word identical to the Masoretic text. He made a follow-up video basically explaining that that's not literally the case. So there are
literally
Literally
the case.
I'm sorry, it's not literally, but it's there are minor like word differences. I think what he meant here is that the sentences verse by verse are the same. They are conveying the exact same message, even if like one word is swapped out for another word, or like the spelling is slightly different. Yeah. So I want to play his response video, at least part of it, so that we can see that. I don't know what the copyright is on this, so we might have to just chop this clip in post, but let's see.
And it's been quite the week. I did want to come on here, though, and say a few things. My time with Rogan was amazing, but both myself and others have caught some things I said that weren't correct. And so, in light of that, I'm going to be making a response video to myself. I think it's the 10th article of the Mormon Church is that they believe the Bible insofar as it is translated. It's not the 10th, Wes. You lied. It's the 8th article of the Mormon Church that says that.
It's false.
Egypt is like Greece in that you have like, you can go to the Pantheon and you see that kind of stuff, right?
Pure fiction.
The Pantheon? Are you kidding me? The Pantheon is in Rome. Do you mean the Parthenon?
We made this one up.
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
I'm pretty sure that's 500.
Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once. You said it wrong again?
It's a made-up tale.
Ignatius of Antioch, arguing that there are only 4 Gospels. He's in the 2nd century.
It's a total fabrication.
Ignatius? I think you meant Irenaeus. Listen, Wes, even Rogan catches you in your own mistakes. Actually, the oils in your hands are more abrasive than latex or even cloth.
So
the oils are more abrasive.
No, sorry, I said that wrong. They're less abrasive.
Okay. You are fake news.
Now, obviously, I'm being a little bit self-deprecating. These are slips, ones that in a 3-hour plus, no topics outlined beforehand, no notes, non-linear conversation happen. And so I hope that you can give me a break for these obvious and clear missteps. There is, however, a criticism I'm seeing online that I think does require some attention and correction on my part. At around the 40-minute mark, Joe asked me a question about the Great Isaiah Scroll. And when he asks me how close it is to the modern Hebrew copies of Isaiah, I say that it is word for word identical to the later Masoretic text. This was admittedly a hyperbolic statement that I should have been much more careful on. My area of expertise when it comes to manuscripts is almost exclusively New Testament, although I do have some work with a handful of 1st century Greek fragments on the Dead Sea Scrolls for comparative work, and I note in my doctoral dissertation instances of parashot, division markers in the Hebrew text of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So up front, I am not, nor do I claim to be, a Dead Sea Scrolls expert, but let me tell you why I said what I said. What was going on in the back of my mind was a quote that I was recalling from Old Testament scholar Gleason Archer's A Survey of the Old Testament, where he talks about the copies of Isaiah found in Qumran Cave 1 in 1947, that they were 1,000 years earlier than the oldest dated manuscripts previously known, proving to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible, and more than 95% identical to the Masoretic text, specifically the Leningrad Codex, calling it almost letter for letter with that manuscript. Also, I had only a few months previously to this discussion with Rogan, read Old Testament textual critic Emmanuel Tove's Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, where he breaks down the variants of 1Q Isaiah B and compares them to the Leningrad Codex, describing the differences with the word minutia. Granted, both Archer and Tove are talking about 1Q Isaiah B, and my statement to Rogan was specifically in context to 1Q Isaiah A, but that is what was going through my mind when I had the conversation. At the same time, I have actually been in contact with a number of Old Testament scholars, even ones who specialize in 1Q Isaiah A itself, who have assured me that although there is disagreement across the scholarly spectrum, the statements are equally applied across both documents. However, what I should have said to Rogan is what I said to Billy Carson when he brought up his statement about Codex Sinaiticus, that Sinaiticus is nearly identical to modern Greek critical texts that we use to produce translations today. Rogan's reaction to the correction of wording should be exactly the same. It is a wow moment. And please hear me out here. I do not think there aren't textual variants in the Isaiah Dead Sea Scroll texts. I don't. In fact, later on in my conversation with Rogan, I specifically say
ancient Hebrew doesn't have a vowel system in its writing that's overly comprehensive. And so in the Middle Ages, when you have these groups of Jews who are copying these Hebrew scriptures, who aren't speaking it as much as they're reading it, you got to figure out how to pronounce it because vowels make a difference. But if you took all the vowels out of English, if you were a natural English reader, you could probably figure out what was what if you're looking at the page. And so in the Middle Ages, the Masoretic scribes come up with these vowel pointing systems. And that's what you see when you look at a Hebrew Bible today, is you see these vowels.
What I'm pointing out there is that there is an entire vowel system with the manuscripts of the later medieval text that are completely absent from the ancient Hebrew copies that we have, like that of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That means that there are going to be variants that are counted and included that have to do with vowels absent from ancient manuscripts that are present in medieval ones. I'm not saying that those are all of them or even most of them, but that even that statement to Rogan is a tacit admission that there are, of course, differences. The same thing goes for Codex Sinaiticus. There are multiple textual variants between Sinaiticus and the medieval copies, and then the modern critical text we use to make English translations today. However, the vast majority of these are almost completely inconsequential, have no bearing on when we translate them into English, and don't impact any essential Christian doctrine that could not be derived from other texts absent of textual complexity throughout the manuscript traditions.
All right, cool. So I think that's super cool that he actually made this video in response and corrected some of his mistakes. For one, it's super valuable for debating, and also I assure you there's plenty of skeptical people that have made responses to the Wes Huff Joe Rogan podcast, this kind of is going to answer some of their objections. So that's really good that he did that.
Yeah,
it's a good lesson to us as well.
I for sure respect that. Like, owning up to a couple of mistakes that you like misworded, but good example for us. I'm sure. I mean, I know for sure I've said things incorrectly, so it's a good reminder to really know what you're talking about, and if you do make a mistake, to own up to it and make sure you're not misleading people and misinformation.
100%. So this clip here is kind of just Joe mentioning again the Isaiah scroll, and you can tell that this particular point was important to him.
In blood, and that he lived on another planet, and that was circled around the star.
By the way, context, they're talking about Mormonism, I believe, right here,
or called Kolob, and that if you do everything right, you will also be the God on your own planet. And so you got to encourage people to have kids, because you're pulling those spirit babies out of the spiritual realm. But you're right; they're incredibly nice people.
The nicest.
Yeah,
it's a really great cult. I mean, or religion, whatever. I mean, I used to have a joke in my act that a cult is fake and it's made by one guy. That guy invented it. In a religion, that guy's dead.
There might be something to that.
Yeah, and some for sure. But the question to me is always, what were they originally trying to do?
Right.
What was it based on? What in the beginning there was light. What is all of that?
Yeah.
What are those stories?
Yeah.
And when you take these stories and you are telling them for so long, that's why the book of Isaiah, what you were telling me, is so fascinating. That 1,000 years later, you have the exact translation of this at a time where most people were illiterate. Right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's only really been recently that we have the levels of literacy that we have today. I mean, this is part of the reason why you have these long spans of time between like when people live and then the ancient biographies that start to pop up about them, is because most people are just illiterate.
But imagine how crazy that is. That something in a time where there's no printed press and something that had been passed on for so long as an oral tradition is exact word for word written.
It's pretty wild.
You find in a cave in Qumran.
Yeah.
And then the same thing you get in the English translation of the Bible today. That's nuts.
Yeah. I mean, up until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the New Testament manuscripts predated the Old Testament manuscripts by a long shot.
Really?
Yeah. Because the Christians were less discerning in their proliferation of written documents. So the Jews had this whole system where you had to be a trained scribe, and they were very, very careful with the procedures that you went through. Whereas the Christians were like, we want to get this thing out as fast as we can, as often as we can, which had a lot of benefits in that, like, their goal was a proselytization and evangelism, and that worked. But the downside of it was that you get really messy copies where you have copies all over the place, but human error gets involved with like spelling differences and, additions, deletions, mostly for completely like understandable reasons. But we actually have manuscripts where we know the person copied it and they didn't know how to read it because they make mistakes that you wouldn't make if you knew how to copy. There's this really great example of a guy who copies, I believe it's the genealogy of Matthew.
Okay. So you can see that this definitely was important to Joe. You guys have any thoughts?
I mean, he's just so less stubborn than he was before.
Yeah.
I mean, I know he was talking with another comedian. That was Red Band, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So like the environment is definitely different, but you can just see how less stubborn he is of like, it took this long for him to realize that he doesn't know everything.
Yeah.
And that, because I feel like a lot of people do kind of have that mindset. I know, like younger people like our age, we feel like we've figured life out, and then we slowly realize that like, oh yeah, we have no idea what's going on.
Right.
So it's cool to see that even there, he was probably in his late 40s or whatever.
He's in his 50s here.
Well, I'm talking about the previous video.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
How 40s, even from there to now, like how much he's changed.
Yeah.
So like that's just really cool to see that he's way less stubborn and more open to it, because he asked for like a box of evidence or whatever the wording was there. Yeah. And then he was given something that, even
take a few
predates another 1,000 years, which is absolutely insane. The literature.
Literature.
And it's cool. I think the conversation between Wes and Joe is a good example for anyone in general. I mean, even when we talk to people who have different beliefs or religions, sorry. I think to go about having a conversation where you can ask questions and you can talk is a really healthy and good way to actually approach things, where you can actually learn from people who know more than you about other things, because even as Christians, we shouldn't be like closed off to someone else because they believe something else. We can still learn from them, and it's good to know, why do you believe this?
Yeah.
Where did you get your evidence? How did you find this?
Yeah.
And one other quick thing I want to add is, when Wes was talking about when the Christians were pushing out Bibles as fast as they could, but there still was mistakes, God was still able to use that to promote just the word of God. And even with a small human errors, God can still use that for his glory.
Yeah.
Which is cool.
Yeah. And now we have all these copies spread out all over the world, and they're very old, and you can actually use, he talks about it in the podcast, you can use computers and even like large language models to reconstruct what the original text might have looked like. It's almost like God knew like what we would need in today's day and age to be evidence. Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah, right.
Now imagine this, like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years down the road, Joe Rogan like finds God.
Yeah.
I'm saying
we should hope and pray for that.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome.
So this is a clip about so he's just talking about the reason why history as written back then might not look like a history that we write now. So the example he brings up is like, why is there not a ton about Jesus when he was young? And back then that they wouldn't have seen that as important. So this is kind of an interesting clip.
It's icing. Then you get the main idea more. Ancient writers talk about this. So there's a guy named Quintilian who exists in the 1st century BC. And there's this series of writings that we call progymnasmata, which are basically like, how do you do good writing? So he's training people, maybe even individuals like Plutarch, who is one of the best known ancient biographers, and saying like, it's just as important what you don't say as to what you do say. Because you don't want to, writing in the ancient world is expensive, really expensive. And B, you want to make sure that your audience is actually getting the message that you want to convey. And so this is something that when you read like German scholars, biblical scholars of the 19th and 20th century, or even prior to that, like 18th, 19th century, they look at the Gospels and they're like, this isn't biography, because it's not capitalizing on Jesus's childhood. And we all know that good biographies tell about your childhood and psychologize and these sorts of things. Whereas if you look at some of these ancient writers who are talking about how you should write biography, they say, if there's nothing in their childhood that's that significant, don't write it. It's going to distract from, like, if there is something, say like Jesus's birth, or Luke tells a story when he's 12 of Jesus, when he goes with Mary and Joseph, and Mary and Joseph lose the Son of God and they start going home without him, and they're like, where's Jesus? And they got to go back to Jerusalem. That's a significant story. And so it appears that Luke includes it because there's a significant reason to include that. But they wouldn't have had any problem with leaving out large portions of someone's life if it didn't contribute to what the ultimate goal of telling that person's life was.
I think what's important is we have to try, as difficult as it might be, to put our minds in the context of people who lived in a time where most people were illiterate, and you're telling these parables.
Okay. Hold on. You're going to tell me you're given the most important task this world will ever. Right. I mean, I've known this story, but I forgot that tidbit that Mary and Joseph left without Jesus, the Savior of the universe.
Jesus. Like, it's Jesus. How do you?
Yeah.
There must have been more to it. There has to be. There's no
think...
way that they were just walking back and they're like, they made it that far and they're like, oh, our child.
Jesus wasn't a middle child, so it's like no middle child vibes.
Yeah, right.
He had like his own little quest off by himself.
All right, but anyways.
Yeah.
Another important point from that is that we shouldn't be like, we should try our best to not have our cultural influences and expectations be read into the Bible, or especially like studying the history and evidence for the Bible. That was the mistake that those like 18th or 19th century historians were making, is that they had expectations about what a biography looks like. And that's not necessarily the case for someone 2,000 years before that, or 1,800 years before that.
I also didn't know that like writing was expensive.
Yeah.
I guess if it was like the ink or just the material.
Yeah, probably the paper or the vellum, the sheepskin or whatever they were using.
At one point, he made a comment, or he was talking about how the Bible kind of came together as a thing and how it was written, and how the guy that did it was at the time kind of the only person who could do it because of how much it cost, because parchment is sheepskin. And he was saying it would cost it would be like hundreds of lambs that would have had to be, used to make the Bible.
Yeah.
And it was so expensive. And so only the people that could do it was like kings, pharaohs, people who had that type of wealth, at their expense. And so, it's not just like, you go to FedEx and for $5 you print out an entire Bible.
Along with all just the money and the material, but you also had to have someone who was educated.
Yeah.
Who could do it.
Yep.
Which is also not as common. Like Joe was saying, it was not a lot of people were educated to like read and write during that time period.
Yep.
So.
Yep.
Yeah, our perception now is books are super cheap, and we can easily print like 100 million of them, just like no issue.
It's like
Mr. Hiccups over there.
If you guys didn't watch the main podcast, James has a very extreme condition of hiccups.
Yeah, I've been hiccuping since I was like 8.
Just nonstop.
Yeah, literally, it happens every like 30 minutes, I'd say.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
It's just the one though.
Yeah, it's just one.
And then, he needs prayer. That's what he needs.
Please. It's a problem.
Yeah. I do like though how he mentions, I mean, like I said, Milo, it's good we can't have our day and age influence how things were done during that time period, and how they talk about the importance. It's just as important to write about something as it is to not to. Because I mean, we were given that story of Jesus being separated from Mary and Joseph and going to the temple and talking to the Pharisees and teachers.
Yeah. And
that's a significant story that we're given for a reason. But I think obviously there's a reason why we don't get to learn about, Jesus' teachings until he's like, 33? Somewhere around there?
Yeah. 30, I think.
30s. Yeah. And I never really thought about that too, because we get the birth of Jesus, 12 years old, years go by, and then he's a man. So
yeah.
He's probably just going through his what do you call that? Like his winter arc or something. He was gaining intelligence and until it was really worth writing it down.
Yeah.
But.
It would be cool to know, I guess, the in between as well, but there's a reason why we don't. So
yeah.
They kind of refer to when you're in a lecture or something in college, and you have people that write down every single thing that the professor is saying, or you just have people that write down the important pieces, and it's more beneficial to just write down the big pieces.
I like that.
Yeah, and everything. Yeah, that was a good way that he described it.
Another thing is, imagine a world where paper is not as easy to come by. Maybe people don't know how to write. The way you record information is by memorizing that. I think there's probably something to that they were much more adapted maybe, or just more inclined to memorize what people say. So we kind of look at that as like, oh, how could you memorize like a speech or what happened? But we don't operate like that anymore.
They also didn't have like TikTok and Instagram to make their attention span about 5 seconds.
True.
That's true.
Yeah, they spent years.
Was it Joe that mentioned it was like Socrates or
Socrates sounds familiar.
One?
We did talk
Yeah,
about
it was.
Yeah,
I
where
think it was Socrates.
he promoted, or he always emphasized on like it's lazy to use a pen and paper. You should exercise your brain and your memory more.
Yeah.
Which is, I haven't thought about that before, because there's times where I forget things so fast. Someone will tell me their name, 2 seconds later, boom, I forgot it. Yeah. It's like they probably were a lot better at memorizing back then than we are when we can write, type, save everything. Our knowledge, we have iClouds, things that save our memory and storage in a virtual memory thing where it's like...
Yeah, but to be fair, I mean, there was significantly less people back then. You've met more people in your life than those people probably had in their towns.
Yeah.
Like, it was a lot easier to remember people because you knew like 20 of them.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think that they thought like that, because we know our society could not function like that. Mm-hmm. There's no way we would be able to function at the level of technology that we have, level of production and just GDP, and like the amount of information that is constantly being produced. We couldn't function without being able to record this stuff in a more permanent way.
Do you think that those people who did memorize those ancient scripts, which then were translated into the Bible, do you think like they knew the importance of that for years to come, like in today's world, where they're like, we need to preserve and memorize this to the T? I
don't think they were thinking 2,000 years into the future, but they were definitely thinking the future, 100 years from now. Yeah.
That's really cool. I mean, they had a really important role. And
yeah, especially in the Old Testament, or not especially, but for sure in the Old Testament, when God would directly interact with people too, like they would not want to lose that and those experiences. They would definitely want to pass those down, because they were so remarkable or like incredible, like that you'd want to pass that information down.
Like imagine Jesus gets done talking about Sermon on the Mount,
right?
And the dude's piece of sheep skin just like flows out of his hands and it's just gone forever.
Yeah.
Or like if all of a sudden there was just no more technology nowadays, and like let's just say aliens came from space, and that was like the only way that you could, write down what had happened, you would immediately like write down what would happen, and you would want to make sure that the people in the future would know, hey, the aliens came down and destroyed everything.
They only took Brandon though.
Yeah, and I think
it's a stretch, but you know what I'm saying.
They probably just listened to that.
Yeah, know what I'm saying.
I don't know if they wrote things down.
Know what I mean? Know what I'm saying?
Even, but I feel like
I would assume. I think someone was probably recording what was going on.
Well, maybe because they said it was like really expensive, and like the people he was preaching to were probably not very.
They were probably.
Well, that's what I'm saying. They weren't writing it down.
Yeah,
they probably
crazy
just
memory.
It, like the Sermon on the Mount. Like I have like a few verses across it like memorized, but like just imagine like hearing that and then being like, all right, like I remember the whole thing.
I can't even remember a license plate.
I mean, it's
that's
you're incredible.
What I mean?
What?
I'm gonna have to put that.
Your memorization of Incredibles.
Oh yeah, well that
So
and that's like
like repetition. Like I've seen that movie like 80 times or something. So.
And that's where like the real faith comes into play of trusting God that these things were remembered correctly. And I think, Emil, you mentioned before, it probably was not like exactly word for words they said, but it was summarized to get that point that needed to get across that Jesus was talking about.
Right.
And that's where like our faith and our trust needs to come into play about that. These things were recorded, memorized, and written down correctly as the Word of God that we have today.
Okay, so 100% agree with that. However, a skeptical person is going to say, I don't believe in God, so I don't have that faith that these things were written down correctly, and that they were actually conveying that information that actually occurred back then. The response to that is, all of ancient history is like that. So you're gonna if you don't have some level of trust that these people wrote down what they saw, then you can't really believe any ancient history.
That's true.
Like, yes, there's archaeological evidence for some things, but that's only going to get you so far. That'll get you like maybe where they had a city, or what technology they had. It's not going to get you much information about what happened. So if you want to believe in any ancient historical texts, you have to have some level of trust that they actually wrote down what happened.
It's a good point.
It's a very good point.
There's that saying of history is written by the victor.
Yeah.
And it's like, what purpose would they have to, if they were to, incorrectly write this down, to be like, yeah, this guy who claims to be the son of God died.
Yeah.
Why would you record that if like, at that, especially what he talks about with like how significant being crucified was, why would that be something that you would record?
It's shameful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, he was saying at one point that like the Romans, if you were a Roman citizen, you were not allowed to be crucified because it was beneath you. And so why would you ever record the Son of God being crucified if like, if you had the power to record whatever you wanted?
Yeah.
There was importance in doing these things accurately, for the historical purposes of recording all this.
Yeah.
And I'll make another point too. I don't know how, obviously, like we said, these things could have happened, and like you said, and then 1,000 years later it was written. But let's say, for an instance, if there was a time that there was an event and they recorded right away, don't you think there'd be people challenging it if they were to see it or read it, where they're like, hey, this, I remember I was there, or I remember someone was talking about this. This is not what happened.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I feel like there'd be some kind of challenge or pushback to be like, this is false, or that you are not telling the truth.
Or maybe
here.
a different recording of it. Like
Correct.
Someone went and recorded a different event, but it's like it's consistent across the board with all of this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the evidences for the empty tomb is that I think the Jewish response to the disciples' claim that the tomb was empty was that the disciples must have stolen away the body. But that implies that the tomb actually was empty. So many people visited the tomb and probably recognized, yeah, there's no body in the tomb. What happened? So it's evidence that there actually was an empty tomb. And that is a portion of the overall argument for the resurrection. That's one of like the facts that's accepted.
Yeah, I feel like this was maybe brought up very briefly a couple episodes ago, but you said there's like an apologetics argument too, that Jesus was so against what the Jews would have been taught, like being a humble servant, or sorry, let me finish that thought. He was very different of what they would have been taught of who the Messiah was going to be.
Yep.
Another voice crack there.
I was past it.
And
I forgive.
So like they would have thought that it was, like a superhero basically, that like conquered Rome, freed them basically, but instead it was this like carpenter who like, was in the low parts of society, hanging out with like prostitutes and like
tax
collectors, and lepers and like just lowest of low people.
Right.
That's definitely an encouragement. And after this, like I want to look into more of like apologetics and like more of this like archaeological stuff. I feel like
if there was only a book
on guard
that we
had,
had.
Craig.
Yeah, no, that was perfect timing, dude.
Yeah.
I feel like after watching this podcast, like it just kind of gives me encouragement that like I will always need to grow stronger in my faith and like understand like the Bible more, and that's obviously the core of what we should be studying. Like that's the most important part.
Yes.
But all this stuff too is like just extra tools that I think are.
If you want to have any chance of being able to give answers to the people of today's day and age, you need to know some apologetics, because the society we live in is very secularized and very very skeptical of these things.
Yeah.
They're skeptical in a way that people were not in Jesus's time. They were skeptical for different reasons. They were skeptical of Jesus because it was absurd to them that God would be crucified. Right. Not that they weren't skeptical of there being a God. They were just skeptical that Jesus was God.
Yeah.
So you always have to tailor the answers to the society that you live in.
Yeah. We can
I want to play this last clip here, and we don't really, I mean, it's more just amazing that Wes Huff was able to give the gospel right at the end here to Joe Rogan. I think it's just,
and then we'll kind of wrap it up after.
One of the greatest things that I've seen in my life.
That was the Son of God. And is it important?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, what does it mean? It's just the fact that it's a question to ponder is a miracle in itself, in a way. Just the fact that there's this concept of this person that died for our sins, that's the Son of God. But you have to you have to believe in a bunch of stuff to go that way. Like, just the concept of that is interesting to people, because what it can do to people is offer them a very unique way to change the way they feel about the world itself. And if you do follow that, I know a lot of Christians that are hardcore Christians that are some of the nicest people you'll ever meet in your life. So it does work. You right? Like, if you do live like a Christian and you do follow the principles of Christ, you will have a richer, more love-filled life. So it is true, right? But you have to submit to this concept that this guy was the child of God who came down to earth, let himself be crucified, came back from the dead, explained a bunch of stuff for people, and then said, all right.
Isn't that cool that he recognizes that?
Yeah.
His tone of voice too from that first clip that you showed
different.
us is so different.
Yeah.
It's so much more soft and like wow.
Maybe it's also moving to Austin, Texas, or just Texas in general. Maybe he's just coming.
He was wound
across,
up in LA.
Yeah, exactly. Like, maybe he's just like met a lot more really good Christians. I don't know.
You can really tell too that he's genuinely thinking about and considering, and like the gears are going in his head. Like it's not it's no longer like a myth that he thinks of it. It's more of a, like he said, it's a question to ponder. And he said it's a miracle in of itself that we have this concept.
He's taking it seriously now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think God's for sure working there. We have no idea what, what's going through, if he has any kind of relationship with God, but, we can definitely for sure pray that one day he could come to know him and use his platform, because that'd be crazy.
Yeah.
So you want to come back?
I was just going to play this last part with Wes.
Go for it.
And you don't know how you can wrap your head around that particular claim.
And if he came back, here's the thing. If he came back, who the fuck would believe him today? With all the fake news and all the CGI and AI, like, imagine. That would be the most bizarre thing of all time. If we get to a point where artificial reality is indiscernible from regular reality, and Jesus chooses to come back at that moment, boy, that's the ultimate test of faith, right? When it's impossible to discern. If we really reach a point where virtual reality is indistinguishable from regular reality, which we're probably 100 years away from that or something. Like, how far? Maybe not even that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's probably why Jesus came in the 1st century and not the 21st century.
But imagine if that's the big catch. Like, Jesus does return, but when he returns, we're just so confused that we can't even tell.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's how he returns in the first place. Maybe he returns through AI.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the portal to Jesus.
I don't know anything about that. Yeah, I mean,
that scares the shit out of me.
I really appreciate, guys that you're friends with, right? Like the Jordan Petersons and the Douglas Murrays of the world, or, the Tom Hollands, not the Spider-Man actor, the historian, who talk about this stuff. I think I really like the way that Jordan Peterson articulates it, but I think he misses the forest for the trees.
How so?
In that he sees Jesus as an archetype. And I don't think actually even Jesus gives you the opportunity to see him as the archetype.
because I have this love-hate relationship with all of Peterson's stuff, because he seems to get so much right where he walks up to the line, but he doesn't want to cross over.
And is the crossover, you think, connected to a life in academia? Or
no.
What do you think it is?
I wonder, and I'd love to talk to him about this, like, how do you remedy this issue that, because he seems to think that the concept of Jesus as an example is more important than the actual flesh and blood first century itinerant Jewish preacher who was crucified and rose from the dead physically, which is the claim of the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. That's an example for us to look on and live by. But I actually think that Jesus condemns moralism. And ultimately what I see Peterson doing is looking at Jesus as a moral example. And if Jesus is nothing but a moral example, then you can save yourself and you don't actually need a savior. And so I think actually Jesus would have critiqued that, because Jesus was very against moralism.
And how do you define Jesus being against moralism? Like, what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, Jesus looks at the religiosity of his day with like particular groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are these other groups of Jews during his day. So we talked about the Essenes, who actually aren't mentioned in the Bible, but there are other groups like the Pharisees, who are like lay scholars, and the Sadducees, who are professional priest scholars. And he's constantly critiquing the fact that they have this hypocritical religiosity to them, where they're doing things like tithing their mint leaves, like to make sure that they get all of. This is where we get the idea of the letter of the law versus the intention of the law. Like, Jesus critiques them for that, because he says, you're trying to do everything right and you're missing the point. So one of the things he says is like, if your donkey falls in a ravine on the Sabbath, do you pull it out? Or is that work? Like, what's the point of the Sabbath? Is it to not do any work? Like, is it to make sure that you're not working too hard because you might be breaking the Sabbath? Or like, what is the point? He says, like, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And that there's this intention. This is the whole Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5.
Shout out.
He keeps saying, you have heard it said, but I say, and he refers to the Mosaic Law. And it looks like he's critiquing the Mosaic Law, but he's not actually. He's getting back to the intention of the law. So when he says, you have heard it said, do not commit murder, but I say to you, anybody who harbors a hate for their brother in their heart has already committed murder. And what he's getting to is like, what's the intention? What's the meaning of the law that God gives to you? Because the law is like a mirror. It shows you how dirty you are. But his critique is, he's like, you guys are trying to clean yourself with a mirror. That's stupid. It's just if anything, it's gonna make you more messy. Like, get in the shower. The law is not what cleans you. The law is what reveals that you're dirty. And so in that sense, I think, if Jesus is a moral example,
that's a good analogy.
It actually misses what I think Jesus actually said about what his purpose was, in that you can't do enough to actually live up to the standard that God holds you to. And so if you keep striving, you're actually going to wear yourself out and be exhausted.
Like atheists.
I didn't say you did, Joe.
A lot of them go crazy. They go crazy when they get older.
Yeah.
Yeah. Listen, Wes, this is such an awesome conversation, and I'm sad that it went down the way it went down with you and Billy, but the good thing out of it is that a lot of people became aware of your work, and it's such exhaustive work. It's really amazing what you've done. Thank you so much for these gifts. We will find a great place for them on the wall here. And thanks and let's do it again. And I would love to do it with you and someone who disagrees too. I think it would be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think it would be really cool.
This has been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Oh, tell everybody how to find you, how to find.
All right. I'm looking forward to part 2.
Yeah. Well, I think we're a little over an hour here, but it's a good point to wrap up. So once again, if you guys haven't had the chance to watch the full Joe Rogan and Wes Huff episode, we highly recommend it. It's long, but it's really got some great stuff on there from you can see from the clips. Give it a listen, see what you think about it. And we'll see maybe years down the road how Joe maybe has continued to change. We pray that, he comes to find Christ. But off of that, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and also share. This is the Campfire Council Podcast.